The moment the room went quiet, I knew my younger sister's marriage was hanging by a thread. My brother-in-law Trevor still had half a grin on his face like he thought the whole thing was a joke. Across the Thanksgiving table, his father, a retired Marine colonel with silver hair and hands thick from decades of service, was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost walk through the front door. "Boy," he said slowly. Not loudly, not angrily. Worse. The kind of voice older military men use when they already know someone has crossed a line they can't uncross. Apologize now. You could hear the dishwasher humming in the kitchen. My sister Denise stopped cutting the pecan pie. One of the grandkids dropped a fork onto the hardwood floor. Trevor blinked twice, confused, like he couldn't understand why the temperature in the room had suddenly fallen 20 degrees. 10 seconds earlier, he'd been laughing at me. Laughing hard. "So what you served coffee on base, right?" I remember the smell of turkey and brown sugar glaze hanging in the air when he said it. Everybody around the table had chuckled politely, the kind of laugh families use when they know something is rude but don't want to make things uncomfortable during the holidays. I'd set my glass down carefully. "Try again." Trevor smirked wider. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" And I answered him the same way I might have commented on the weather. "Top Gun instructor." That was when his father froze. Not because of the movies, not because of the name itself, but because men like Richard Hayes knew exactly what it took to earn that title. And suddenly, after 40 years of being invisible in my own family, everybody at that table was looking at me differently. Funny how fast people can rearrange their opinion of you once they realize you were never weak to begin with. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 62 years old, retired Navy, and until that Thanksgiving dinner in Northern Virginia, most of my family thought I'd spent my military career pushing paperwork behind a desk somewhere. Honestly, I'd let them think it. It was easier that way. The trouble with accomplishments is that people often treat them like ownership. The minute relatives discover you've done something difficult, they rewrite history. Suddenly they supported you all along. Suddenly they always believed in you. But that wasn't how my story went. I drove to Denise's house that Thanksgiving through cold November rain with an overnight bag in the trunk and every intention of keeping my head down for 48 hours. Her subdivision looked like every upper-middle-class neighborhood built outside Washington during the late 90s, brick homes, trimmed lawns, SUVs lined neatly along curbs. The kind of place where people talked about service more than sacrifice. Denise greeted me warmly enough at the front door, though there was always a stiffness between us that neither of us knew how to fix anymore. "Evie," she said, hugging me lightly, "long drive. About 4 hours. You should have flown." I almost smiled at that. After 30 years around military aviation, commercial flying had become the one thing I avoided whenever possible. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon candles and roasted turkey. Football played softly from the living room television, while grandchildren raced through the hallway wearing paper turkey hats they'd made at school. It should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt like visiting a version of America I'd spent my life protecting but never quite belonging to. Trevor stood near the kitchen island holding a beer bottle. Big man. Loud personality. The kind who filled silence because he couldn't tolerate it. "Hey," he called when he saw me. "Denise's mysterious sister finally made it." "Mysterious?" I asked. "Well, sure," he laughed. 30 years in the military and nobody knows what you actually did." I took off my coat slowly. Most people never asked. Richard Hayes was sitting quietly near the fireplace when I walked in. Straight posture despite being well into his 70s. One glance told me everything I needed to know about him, old-school Marine Korea veteran father, probably Vietnam himself. Men like him recognized military habits the way musicians recognize rhythm. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. Respectful. Observant. Not performative. That was the first moment all evening I relaxed. Dinner itself started pleasantly enough. Denise had gone all out sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from an actual recipe instead of a can. The grandchildren argued over whipped cream, while Trevor dominated every conversation within reach. He talked about real estate investments, gas prices, politics, how nobody wants to work anymore. I mostly listened. That's another habit the Navy teaches you. Quiet people hear everything. At some point, the conversation turned toward military service after one of the boys asked whether I'd ever been in a dogfight like Maverick. Trevor laughed before I could answer. "Oh, come on," he said. "Your Aunt Evelyn wasn't flying fighter jets." I shrugged lightly. "Why not?" "Because you're too calm." The table laughed. I did too, a little. Not because it was funny. Because most people think dangerous people look dangerous. Truth is, the deadliest men and women I ever met usually sounded like accountants. Trevor leaned back in his chair. "So what, you served coffee on base, right?" And there it was. Not cruel enough to cause a scene. Just disrespectful enough to establish a pecking order. I saw Denise tense immediately. She knew her husband's mouth could outrun his judgment sometimes. I set my water glass down. "Try again." He grinned. "Then what did you do in the Navy?" I looked directly at him. "Top Gun instructor." Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that arrives when a room suddenly realizes it misunderstood someone completely. Richard Hayes stopped moving altogether. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me. Then he asked the question nobody else in the room understood enough to ask. "Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program." I nodded once. His expression changed immediately. Not excitement. Recognition. The grandchildren looked confused while Trevor laughed nervously. "Wait, seriously." Richard never took his eyes off me. "Boy," he said quietly. Trevor turned toward his father. "Apologize now." Trevor blinked. "Dad, I was kidding." "No," Richard replied. "You were disrespecting somebody who earned more respect by breakfast than you've earned in your whole life. You could have carved the tension with a butter knife." Denise stared at me like she was meeting me for the first time. And the strange thing was, maybe she was. Richard Hayes followed me into the kitchen about 20 minutes later, while the rest of the family pretended to watch football in the living room. That's the thing about uncomfortable family moments. Nobody ever addresses them directly at first. Americans my age were raised to smooth things over quietly, even when the floorboards underneath the family were cracking. I stood at the sink rinsing dishes while Denise hovered nearby pretending to organize leftovers. Every few seconds she glanced toward me, then away again. Like she wanted to ask something but didn't know where to begin. Richard stopped beside the counter. "You flew Tomcats?" he asked softly. I nodded once at first. "And later?" "Super Hornets." He let out a low whistle under his breath. "Not dramatic. Just honest admiration from one old military soul to another. You must have caught the tail end of Cold War training." "Barely." He folded his arms. "Women weren't exactly welcomed into that pipeline back then." "No," I said, "we weren't." Denise finally turned around. "Wait," she said carefully. "You actually flew combat aircraft?" I dried my hands with a towel before answering. "Yes." The room behind us had gone quieter. Trevor was still in there, but now the television volume had magically dropped low enough for everyone to overhear. Families are funny that way. Suddenly I could feel 40 years of assumptions shifting around inside that house like furniture being rearranged. Denise leaned against the counter. "You never told us any of this." I looked at her for a moment. "You never asked." That landed harder than I intended. Her face softened, immediately hurt, mixing with guilt. And right then I almost regretted saying it. Almost. Because the truth was my family stopped being curious about me a very long time ago. Back when we were girls growing up in Ohio, Denise was sunlight. Blonde hair, easy smile, cheerleader ribbons hanging from her bedroom mirror. Everybody loved Denise because Denise made life simple. I was the difficult one. The quiet one. The girl lying on the garage roof at night memorizing aircraft silhouettes while other girls passed notes about boys. Our father used to shake his head every time I brought home another aviation magazine from the library. "You ought to focus on something practical," he'd tell me. Flying is practical. For a man. Richard pulled a chair out slowly and sat down at the kitchen table. "You mind if I ask what your call sign was?" That got Denise's attention immediately. "Call sign," she repeated. I smiled faintly despite myself. Military families understood what that meant. Civilian families usually thought it was something Hollywood invented. I hesitated. Richard noticed. "If it's classified, forget I asked." "It's not classified," I said quietly, "just old." He waited. I looked down at the dish towel in my hands. Iron Widow. For a second, Richard didn't move. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair and muttered one quiet word under his breath. Jesus. From the living room came Trevor's voice. What does that mean? Richard looked toward him. It means your Aunt Evelyn trained fighter pilots during some very dangerous years. I still don't get why everybody's acting like she landed on the moon. That did it. Richard stood so fast his chair scraped hard across the tile floor. Because people died learning those skills, he snapped. The whole house went silent again. Trevor stared at his father in shock. I could tell this wasn't how their family normally operated. Richard probably wasn't a man who raised his voice often. Which meant when he did, it mattered. He pointed toward Trevor. You think military aviation is some kind of joke? You think instructors are glorified babysitters? Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Dad, I said I was kidding. No, Richard replied sharply. You were mocking somebody because you assumed she was small enough to mock. Denise stepped between them gently. Okay, she said softly. Everybody calm down. I hated the direction things were going. Not because Trevor didn't deserve embarrassment. Because public humiliation rarely changes people for the better. It just makes them defensive. I'm not upset, I said. Trevor looked at me suspiciously. Then why didn't you tell anyone who you were? That question hung in the kitchen longer than the others had. Why didn't I? The answer wasn't simple. Because when I graduated near the top of flight school, my father said they were lowering standards. Because when I made instructor, one uncle joked I was probably sleeping with admirals. Because when I missed holidays due to deployments, relatives called me selfish for choosing career over family. After enough years, silence becomes easier than self-defense. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from Richard. You know what happens when people hear words like Top Gun? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. They stop seeing you as a person. The kitchen clock ticked softly. They either worship you or resent you, sometimes both. Richard nodded slowly. He understood. Trevor still looked unconvinced, but less arrogant now. More uncertain. Like he was trying to recalculate the entire evening in his head. Denise sat beside me carefully. I honestly thought you worked logistics or administration. I did some of that too. But why never correct us? I gave a tired little shrug. Would it have changed anything? Nobody answered because everybody knew the answer. Probably not. The grandchildren wandered halfway into the kitchen, then sensing tension but too young to understand it. Denise's youngest granddaughter looked up at me curiously. Did you really fly jets? I smiled at her. Yes. Were you scared? That question made Richard glance toward me again. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not whether I was important. Not whether I was impressive. Whether I was afraid. All the time I told her honestly. The child frowned. Then why'd you do it? I thought about all the funerals. All the folded flags. All the young pilots pretending bravery before missions. And all the instructors like me who carried the burden of preparing them. Because being scared doesn't mean you quit, I said. The little girl considered that seriously before nodding. Children understand courage better than adults sometimes. Trevor stared down at the kitchen floor for a long moment. Then finally he said the words Richard had been waiting for. I'm sorry, Evelyn. Not polished. Not dramatic. But real enough. And strangely, hearing it didn't make me feel victorious. Just tired. Because apologies arrive quickly at 62 for wounds that began at 16. Later that night, after everyone drifted off toward desserts and coffee, Richard found me alone on the back porch, wrapped in Denise's old wool blanket. Cold rain tapped softly against the deck railing. He stood beside me quietly for a while before speaking. You saved lives, didn't you? I kept looking out into the darkness. I trained people, I answered. He nodded slowly. That means yes. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Richard asked the question nobody in my family had ever bothered asking before. What did it cost you? And for the first time all evening, I didn't know how to answer. Richard's question stayed with me long after the porch conversation ended. What did it cost you? Funny thing is, younger people usually ask what you achieved. Older people eventually learn to ask what it took. By midnight, the house had gone quiet except for the refrigerator humming in Denise's kitchen and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. I couldn't sleep, so I sat alone at the dining room table with a cup of decaf coffee that tasted weak enough to qualify as punishment. The same table where only hours earlier my brother-in-law had laughed at me. Life turns quickly sometimes. I heard footsteps behind me around 1 in the morning. Denise appeared wearing a faded University of Virginia sweatshirt and reading glasses she'd probably deny needing during daylight hours. "You always stayed up late?" she asked softly. "Military habit." She poured herself coffee and sat across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. At 60 years old, my sister still tucked loose hair behind her ear the same nervous way she did at 17. "You know," she finally said, "when we were kids, I used to tell people you'd become a scientist." I smiled faintly. "Why scientist?" "You were always taking radios apart." "That drove Dad crazy." That made her laugh quietly. "He thought you were going to electrocute yourself." The mention of our father settled heavily between us. He'd been gone nearly 12 years now. Heart attack at 74, sudden, quick, the kind of death people call merciful because they don't know what else to say. I stared down into my coffee. "He never forgave me for joining the Navy." Denise looked uncomfortable immediately. "He was old-fashioned." "No," I said gently, "he was disappointed." "There's a difference. People from our parents' generation had very fixed ideas about what daughters were supposed to become. Teachers, nurses, secretaries, wives. Safe. Understandable. I was none of those things. Even at 12 years old, I knew ordinary life would suffocate me. While Denise played house with dolls, I memorized aircraft engines from library books. While other girls hung posters of rock stars, I taped photographs of F-14 Tomcats to my bedroom wall. Dad hated those posters. "Looks ridiculous," he'd mutter whenever relatives visited. Mom tried harder to understand me, but even she seemed exhausted by the effort sometimes. "You don't always have to prove something," she told me once. The trouble was, I wasn't trying to prove anything. Flying simply felt like the first honest thing I'd ever loved. Denise stirred cream into her coffee slowly. "Were you really the only woman in your training class?" "Not the only one," I said. "Just one of very few." "And the men gave you trouble?" I let out a dry laugh. "That's one way to phrase it." She looked genuinely curious now, maybe for the first time in our lives, so I told her. "Not everything. Some stories stay buried for a reason. But enough." I told her about flight school in Pensacola during the early 80s, about instructors who assumed women would wash out within weeks, about classmates who stopped talking when I entered briefing rooms, about the exhaustion. God, the exhaustion. People imagine military aviation as glamorous because of movies. They picture leather jackets and triumphant music. Reality is fluorescent lighting at 4 in the morning while someone twice your size critiques every mistake you make. Reality is studying until your eyes blur because one error in the sky can kill people. Reality is understanding that if you fail, some men will use your failure as evidence women never belonged there in the first place. Denise listened without interrupting. "That sounds miserable." "Some of it was." "Then why stay?" I thought about that carefully. Because quitting would have followed me forever. Because every cruel comment fueled me instead of stopping me. Because once I sat inside a fighter jet for the first time and felt those engines wake beneath me, there was no going back to ordinary life. "You know what the strange part was?" I said quietly. "What?" "The sky was the easy part." Denise frowned slightly. "People were harder." That seemed to hit her. Maybe because she realized she'd been part of that without meaning to. Growing up, Denise had always been the easy daughter to love. She married young, had children, hosted Christmas dinners, remembered birthdays. Meanwhile, I missed funerals because of deployments and forgot anniversaries because I lived by military calendars instead of civilian ones. Families forgive warmth more easily than absence. "You know, Dad used to brag about you eventually," Denise said suddenly. I looked up sharply. "He did." "Not publicly," she smiled sadly, "only when his friends weren't around." That hurt more than I expected. All those years I'd thought he was ashamed of me completely. Denise stared into her coffee. "I think he just didn't know how to understand you." "That's not the same thing as trying." "No," she admitted quietly, "it's not." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning. Outside, cold rain drifted against the windows. "You really never married because of the Navy?" Denise asked. I smiled a little. That's the simplified version. There had been men. A few good ones. One almost became my husband back in 1989, naval aviator named Scott Brennan, smart, kind, loved jazz music and terrible diner coffee. He died during a training accident over the Atlantic 3 months before the wedding. After that, I stopped imagining permanent things. Denise covered her mouth softly. Oh my God. I'm all right. But even saying those words after 30 years still carried weight. The military teaches you to continue functioning after loss. It does not teach you how to stop carrying it. I had no idea, she whispered. Most people didn't. That was the pattern of my life, really. Invisible sacrifices, invisible grief, invisible service. And maybe that's why Trevor's joke hit harder than he realized. Not because it insulted my rank, because it erased decades of sacrifice with one careless sentence. Denise reached across the table slowly and touched my hand. I'm sorry too, she said. Simple words. Late words. But sincere. I squeezed her hand gently. You were living your life, I told her. So were you. Yes. She looked at me carefully then. And were you happy? That question caught me off guard. Because accomplishment and happiness are not always neighbors. I thought about roaring engines at sunrise, young pilots graduating under my instruction, lonely apartments near bases scattered across America. I thought about funerals. Missed holidays. Silence. Then I answered honestly. Sometimes. Denise nodded like she understood more than she wanted to. And maybe she did. By morning, nothing in that house had fully healed. But for the first time in decades, the truth had finally entered the room. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit. Some routines never leave you even after retirement. For 30 years my life had been measured by alarms in dark rooms, briefing schedules, flight plans, weather reports, and the sound of boots against concrete before dawn. Civilian life still felt slightly unnatural to me sometimes, like I was borrowing someone else's rhythm. Denise's house was quiet when I walked downstairs wearing jeans and an old navy sweatshirt faded nearly gray with age. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt coffee from the automatic timer machine sputtering on the counter. Richard Hayes was already awake. Of course he was. Old Marines rarely sleep late. He sat alone at the table reading a newspaper with the posture of a man who still expected inspection at any moment. He looked up when I entered. Mornin', Commander. I smiled slightly. Retired, Commander? Still counts. He folded the paper carefully. Coffee. I've survived worse. That earned the first real laugh I'd heard from him. I poured myself a mug and sat across from him while soft November light crept through the kitchen windows. For a while we simply existed in companionable silence. Older people understand silence better than younger ones. We don't rush to fill every empty space anymore. Finally Richard spoke. You know Trevor's embarrassed. He'll survive. He's not a bad man. I didn't say he was. And I meant that. Trevor wasn't cruel at his core. Loud, insecure, thoughtless, sometimes yes, but not malicious. Men like Trevor often mistake confidence for volume because nobody ever taught them the difference. Richard rubbed one rough hand along his jaw. He grew up around stories about military service, he said. But stories and sacrifice aren't the same thing. Number. He thinks respecting veterans means bumper stickers and flag pins. I took a sip of coffee. A lot of Americans do. Richard studied me for a long moment. You're angry? That surprised me. Not because he noticed. Because I hadn't admitted it to myself until then. I looked down into the coffee mug. Yes, I said quietly. About Trevor. I shook my head slowly. About how easy it was. He frowned slightly. What was? For everyone to assume I couldn't possibly have done something difficult. The words came out calmer than I felt. That assumption follows women your whole life, especially women my age. I gave a small shrug. People see gray hair and politeness and suddenly decide you were never dangerous. Richard nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. You know, he said, when I first saw you walk in yesterday, I noticed your posture immediately. That's hard to get rid of. No, he replied, but it told me something. I smiled faintly, that I spent too many years standing inspections. That you carried responsibility. Outside, rainwater dripped softly from the gutters. Richard leaned back in his chair. I heard stories about Iron Widow years ago. That old call sign still felt strange in civilian conversation. Most military nicknames sound ridiculous outside their original context. What kind of stories? I asked. That pilots cried after your evaluations. I laughed quietly into my coffee. Some did. And then they got better. Richard grinned. That's what I heard. I stared out the window for a moment, remembering. Young faces. Nervous hands. Cocky lieutenants pretending confidence before carrier qualifications. Kids, really. Most of them barely old enough to rent cars carrying machines worth millions of dollars onto pitching flight decks in darkness. People romanticize military aviation because they never see the fear. I saw it every day. That was my job. You know why instructors get hard? I asked quietly. Richard shook his head once. Because eventually you realize kindness can kill people. The kitchen went still. I continued carefully. If a pilot freezes during training, you correct it. If they get sloppy, you correct it. If they panic under pressure, you force them through it again and again until instinct replaces fear. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Because one day they'll need it for real. Yes. I stared down at my hands. And sometimes they still don't come home. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. There are certain truths veterans recognize without elaboration. Loss is one of them. Around 8 o'clock, the rest of the household slowly came alive upstairs. Footsteps, running water, cabinet doors opening. Then Trevor entered the kitchen. The confidence from yesterday was gone. Good. Embarrassment can be healthy if it teaches humility. He stood awkwardly near the doorway for a second before looking at me. Morning. Morning. Richard quietly folded his newspaper and stood. I'm gonna check the weather outside. The old Marine was giving us privacy. Subtle. Respectful. Trevor sat across from me after his father left. For a moment he looked younger somehow, less polished, less certain. My dad chewed me out for an hour last night, he admitted. I figured. He said I embarrassed myself. I sipped coffee calmly. Did you? He let out a breath through his nose. Probably. That was progress. He rubbed the back of his neck. I honestly thought you were exaggerating. Most people do. No, I mean... He hesitated. You just don't act like someone important. I almost laughed. There it was again. The misunderstanding. What does someone important act like? I asked. Trevor opened his mouth. Closed it again. Exactly. He looked embarrassed. I guess I expected... He searched for words. More ego. That's television, I said. He nodded slowly. Then after a pause, he asked something unexpected. Did people give you hell because you were a woman? I leaned back slightly. Constantly. He looked genuinely disturbed by that. Even after you proved yourself. Especially then. That seemed to shake him. I think for the first time in his life, Trevor realized competence doesn't protect people from prejudice. Sometimes it attracts more of it. He stared down at the kitchen table. My daughter wants to join the Air Force someday. I smiled faintly. Then teach her not to shrink herself for insecure men. He looked up sharply. Not defensive this time. Thoughtful. And suddenly I saw what Richard had probably been hoping for all along. Not punishment. Growth. Denise entered the kitchen carrying laundry a few minutes later and stopped short when she saw us talking peacefully. Well, she said carefully, this is less terrifying than yesterday. Trevor snorted softly. Low bar. She looked at me uncertainly. You okay? I nodded. Yes. And strangely enough, for the first time since arriving, I actually meant it. That afternoon, Denise insisted everybody take a walk after lunch. Fresh air will stop this family from killing each other, she announced. Nobody argued. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the neighborhood washed clean and smelling faintly of wet leaves and chimney smoke. Northern Virginia in late November always reminded me of old photographs, gray skies, bare trees, and people pretending winter wasn't already waiting around the corner. The grandchildren raced ahead down the sidewalk while the adults followed more slowly in pairs. Trevor walked beside me after a while, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. You know, he said carefully, I looked you up last night. I glanced sideways at him. That dangerous, huh? He gave a nervous laugh. My dad said if I was going to open my mouth about military service, maybe I should educate myself first. Wise man. Trevor nodded. I found articles. That didn't surprise me much. Retirement ceremonies, defense newsletters, aviation publications. Bits and pieces of a career scattered across the internet like breadcrumbs. Most people simply never connected those stories to the quiet woman bringing cranberry sauce to Thanksgiving dinner. What kind of articles? I asked. One about carrier training. He hesitated. Another mentioned you received some kind of commendation after an accident investigation. I looked ahead toward the children. That was years ago. What happened? The memory arrived instantly. Heat. Smoke. A young pilot screaming into a radio. I exhaled slowly through my nose. Mechanical failure during training exercises. Trevor waited. The pilot survived. But barely. He nodded quietly. That was another thing civilians sometimes misunderstood about military life. Survival was not the same thing as escaping unharmed. We walked another 20 feet before Trevor spoke again. My dad said instructors carry guilt for people who die. I stopped walking for a second. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk in cold wind. Yes, I said softly. Trevor's expression shifted immediately, like he realized he'd stumbled onto something heavier than curiosity. I'm sorry, he said quickly. You don't have to apologize for asking. But I appreciated that he cared enough to hesitate. That mattered. We kept walking. Across the street, someone had already put up Christmas lights, even though Thanksgiving wasn't over yet. Red and green reflections shimmered faintly against wet pavement. Trevor glanced toward the grandchildren. Did you lose students? There it was. The real question. I kept my eyes forward. Yes. His face tightened. How many? I stopped counting. That answer silenced him completely. Not because the number shocked him, because he finally understood there was one. People over 60 know something younger people often don't. The older you get, the less impressive glory becomes and the more meaningful endurance feels. Trevor had spent years admiring military imagery. Flags, jets, uniforms. But now he was beginning to see the human cost underneath the symbolism. We returned to the house about half an hour later. Denise started preparing sandwiches while football commentators shouted from the television. The grandchildren disappeared upstairs with tablets and blankets. Ordinary American family life? And somehow that normalcy made the conversation feel even heavier. Richard found me later in the den studying old framed family photos on the bookshelf. You were 21 there, he said, pointing toward a picture of me in dress whites. 22. You looked angry. I was. He laughed quietly. Fair enough. I picked up the frame carefully. That photograph had been taken the day I completed advanced flight training. My father had attended the ceremony wearing a stiff gray suit and the expression of a man pretending support because public embarrassment would look worse. You know what he said afterward, I asked. Richard shook his head. He told me maybe now I'd grow out of this phase. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Christ. I think he genuinely believed military service would eventually make me softer somehow. I smiled faintly. Instead, it made me harder. Richard leaned against the bookshelf. Hard isn't always bad. No, I admitted, but it gets lonely. That word hung between us. Lonely. There it was. Not heroic. Not cinematic. Just true. People imagine loneliness as empty apartments and quiet nights. But the deepest loneliness comes from being fundamentally misunderstood by people who've known you your whole life. Denise entered the room carrying folded towels. You two look serious again. We're old, Richard replied. It's our favorite hobby. She smiled before sitting beside me on the couch. I've been thinking about something, she said carefully. That sounds dangerous. She nudged my shoulder lightly. I mean it. I looked at her. When Mom got sick, Denise hesitated. Why didn't you come sooner? Ah, that wound. The hardest ones are always family questions asked 20 years too late. I was deployed, I answered quietly. You came eventually. Yes, but not until the end. There was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made it worse. I stared at the family photo in my hands. The Navy denied my leave twice. Denise blinked. What? We were short pilots. Her face fell completely. You never told me that. What good would it have done? You could have explained. I gave a tired smile. To who, Dad? The relatives already calling me selfish. Denise looked down at her hands. Because she remembered. The whispers during Mom's final weeks. Poor Margaret. One daughter here every day, the other chasing airplanes. Funny how people build entire moral judgments around information they never bothered verifying. I thought you chose not to come, Denise whispered. No, I said gently. I chose not to defend myself anymore. The room went quiet. Richard looked angry now, though not at me. You carried that alone. I shrugged. Military families do it all the time. Denise's eyes filled with tears. Oh God, Evie. I touched her arm softly before she could spiral into guilt. You loved Mom, I said. That mattered more than misunderstandings. But you loved her too. Yes? And there it was again. The truth nobody had ever fully seen. I had sacrificed family moments for service. But I had also sacrificed service for family every chance I could. And somehow still ended up disappointing both worlds sometimes. Trevor appeared quietly in the doorway then. He looked hesitant, like a man realizing the story he mocked was much bigger than his pride. I owe you more than an apology, he said carefully. I looked at him calmly. Maybe. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, I think I owe you respect. That one felt different. Because respect offered voluntarily means something. Especially from a man finally learning humility. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Richard Hayes called me on a Tuesday morning while I was reorganizing tools in my garage. Retirement does strange things to people. After decades of operating at high speed, you suddenly find yourself spending 30 minutes deciding where to hang a wrench. Evelyn Richards said over the phone, "You busy Saturday night?" I had plans to aggressively avoid social interaction. He laughed. I'm serious. So am I. That old Marine chuckled again before his tone softened. I'd like you to come to the Veterans Relief Gala. I leaned against the workbench. Richard, hear me out first. I already knew the event he meant. Annual fundraiser outside Arlington for veteran families, military widows, and disabled service members. The kind of formal gathering filled with donated wine, patriotic speeches, and retired officers pretending not to compare ribbons. Not exactly my natural habitat anymore. You'd hate it, he admitted honestly, which is why I know you're the right person to invite. That logic feels questionable. I'm old, humor me. I sighed. Why me? The line went quiet for a second. Because too many loud people get celebrated these days, he said. I'd rather honor someone who actually carried weight. That answer sat heavily in my chest. Nobody had ever spoken about my career that way before. Not publicly. Not personally. After we hung up, I stood alone in the garage for a long time staring at dust floating through cold morning sunlight. Then eventually I whispered the same thing I'd whispered before difficult flights for 30 years. All right. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. I wore a simple black dress with a navy blazer instead of formal military attire. My dress uniform still hung preserved in garment bags upstairs, but I had no interest in becoming a walking museum exhibit for one evening. The gala was held at an old hotel ballroom overlooking the Potomac. Warm lights glowed against polished wood floors, while a jazz trio played softly near the entrance. Mostly older crowd. Gray hair. Slow steps. Veterans. Widows. Children of service members. People who understood sacrifice without needing it explained dramatically. I spotted Denise first near the registration table. She hugged me tightly the moment I walked in. You look beautiful, she said. You look nervous. I am nervous. Why? She smiled weakly. Because Richard refuses to tell me what he's planning. That worried me immediately. Oh no. Before she could answer, Trevor approached from across the room wearing a dark suit and the uncomfortable expression of a man attending his own sentencing hearing. Hey, he said carefully. Hey. He shoved his hands into his pockets. I just wanted to say, thanks for coming. That bad, huh? He actually smiled a little. You have no idea. Richard finally appeared near the ballroom entrance wearing a Marine Corps blazer that somehow made him stand straighter than men 20 years younger. When he saw me, his face softened warmly. "There she is." Richard I warned immediately, "If this evening includes public embarrassment, I'm stealing your cane." "You wouldn't dare." "I flew tactical aircraft off moving ships. Test me." That made him laugh hard enough to cough. The evening itself began quietly enough. Dinner, speeches, charity auctions, stories about military families holding themselves together through deployments and grief and impossible years. Real stories. Not Hollywood nonsense. At some point during dessert, Richard stepped onto the small stage near the ballroom windows and tapped the microphone gently. The room settled. "I know everybody's tired of old men talking," he began, "but indulge me a few minutes more." Polite laughter rolled through the ballroom. Richard looked directly toward me. "Most military celebrations focus on visible leadership," he said. "Decorated commanders, public heroes, the names people recognize." His voice grew quieter. "But some of the most important people in military history are almost completely unknown outside the people they trained." My stomach dropped immediately. "Oh, Richard. You sneaky old Marine." Across the room, Trevor gave me an apologetic look, like he suddenly realized what was happening too late to stop it. Richard continued calmly. "Several weeks ago during Thanksgiving dinner, my son embarrassed himself by mocking a woman who spent decades quietly serving this country." Now the ballroom had gone fully silent. I considered climbing out a nearby window. "She never asked for recognition," Richard said, "which is exactly why she deserves it." Then he looked directly at me. "Commander Evelyn Carter, would you stand, please?" God help me. Slowly, reluctantly, I stood. And then something unexpected happened. Several older men across the ballroom straightened immediately. One man near the back whispered "Iron Widow" under his breath. Another veteran stood up first. Then another. And another. Not applause at first. Recognition. The kind earned quietly over years. A retired pilot near the stage approached me slowly with tears already gathering in his eyes. "You probably don't remember me," he said. I looked carefully at his face. Older now, gray-haired, heavy around the shoulders. But familiar. "Danny Ruiz," I said softly. His laugh broke halfway into a sob. "Jesus Christ, you really do remember." "I remember every pilot who almost killed my blood pressure." The room laughed warmly. Danny wiped his eyes quickly. "You failed me twice during carrier qualification. You were reckless. You saved my life." The ballroom went still again. Danny looked around the room before continuing. "I was 24 years old and thought confidence mattered more than discipline." He swallowed hard. 2 years later, combat hit, and every correction she drilled into me kept me alive. Nobody spoke. Because there are moments older Americans recognize instinctively as sacred. Truth was one of them. Danny looked at me again. "You taught us how to come home." I honestly didn't know what to say to that. After all those years, all those funerals, all those lonely nights wondering whether any of it mattered. Suddenly the weight felt visible. Trevor stepped forward then, his face pale, voice unsteady. "I need to say something too." The room turned toward him. He looked directly at me. "A few weeks ago I made fun of someone because I judged her before understanding her." He swallowed hard. "Truth is, I felt insecure around things I didn't understand." Nobody moved. Trevor took a breath. "I thought being loud made me important." His eyes dropped briefly. I was wrong. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I believed him. The drive home from the gala felt strangely peaceful. Not triumphant. Not dramatic. Just quiet. At my age, I'd learned that real closure rarely arrives with fireworks. Most healing enters softly like evening light through old curtains. The highway south was nearly empty. Christmas lights glowed from distant neighborhoods, while old holiday songs drifted through the radio low enough not to interrupt my thoughts. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. And oddly enough, that realization hurt a little. Because once people finally saw me clearly, I couldn't stop wondering how different life might have been if they'd bothered sooner. A few days later, Denise called asking if I'd come for Christmas. Not out of obligation. Not because Richard insisted. Because she wanted me there. That distinction mattered. "I don't want you staying at a hotel this time," she said firmly over the phone. "You're family." Family. Such a simple word for something so complicated. I arrived Christmas Eve carrying a pecan pie from a roadside bakery and fully expecting awkwardness. Instead, Trevor opened the front door wearing an apron dusted with flour. "I'm on biscuit duty," he announced solemnly. "Pray for everyone." I laughed before I could stop myself. And just like that, something shifted. Not erased, not magically repaired, but softened. The grandchildren swarmed the living room floor, surrounded by wrapping paper and battery-operated chaos. Denise had decorated the house with old-fashioned colored lights instead of the blinding white ones everyone uses now. The whole place felt warmer. More honest somehow. Richard sat near the fireplace wearing a thick cardigan and reading glasses while pretending not to supervise everybody. "You're late," he grumbled as I walked in. "I was avoiding your cooking." That was one time. One traumatic time. He pointed a crooked finger at me. Still disrespectful. The family laughed. And hearing myself inside that laughter instead of outside, it felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Later that evening after dinner, dishes were stacked, and the grandchildren disappeared upstairs with new toys. Trevor handed me a glass of wine and motioned toward the back porch. Cold winter air greeted us outside. The neighborhood glowed softly beneath Christmas lights and quiet suburban darkness. Trevor leaned against the railing. "You know," he said, "I used to think confidence meant always having something to say." I smiled faintly. "That explains a lot." He laughed softly. "Fair." For a moment we simply stood there listening to distant wind moving through bare trees. Then his expression grew serious again. "I owe you another apology." "Trevor." "No, listen." His voice carried none of the defensiveness from Thanksgiving. Only honesty. "I spent years teaching my son to respect veterans." He shook his head slowly. "But I never realized respect also means shutting up long enough to learn who people really are." That one landed deep. Because it wasn't just about military service anymore. It was about life. About aging. About how many older Americans quietly carry histories nobody around them ever notices. I looked out across the neighborhood. "When you get older," I said softly, "people start assuming your story is already finished." Trevor nodded slowly. "But it's not." "Number." He glanced toward me carefully. "You ever regret it?" "The Navy." "Everything." That question deserved honesty. I thought about Scott Brennan. Carrier decks at sunrise. Lonely apartments. Missed funerals. Young pilots surviving because of lessons I screamed into them during training. I thought about my father dying before truly understanding me. And Denise finally trying. I regret some costs, I admitted quietly, but not the service. Trevor looked relieved by that answer for reasons I couldn't entirely understand. Inside the house, laughter echoed faintly through the windows. Warm. Human. Temporary. The older you get, the more you treasure temporary things. When we returned inside, Richard waved me toward the dining table where his grandson Luke sat hunched over a model airplane kit. The boy looked up nervously. "Aunt Evelyn?" he asked. "Yes." His cheeks reddened slightly. "Mom says you flew fighter jets." "I did." He hesitated. "I want to fly someday too." Trevor immediately opened his mouth, then stopped himself. "Growth." I hid a smile. "What kind of flying?" I asked Luke. "Air Force, maybe." He glanced at the little plastic airplane in his hands, or Navy. I pulled out a chair beside him. "Then learn humility early." He blinked. "That's the secret." "One of them." I pointed gently toward the unfinished model airplane. "Machines don't care about ego. The sky doesn't either." Luke listened carefully the way children do when they know an adult is finally giving them the real answer instead of a polished one. "You know what makes people dangerous?" I asked. He shook his head. "Thinking they're too smart to learn." Across the room, Richard smiled quietly into his coffee. The evening slowed after that. Old movies on television. Half-asleep grandchildren under blankets. Denise humming softly in the kitchen while wrapping leftovers in foil. Ordinary moments. And somehow, after a lifetime of extraordinary pressure and responsibility, ordinary finally felt precious. Before bed, I found myself alone at the kitchen sink washing dishes while snow began falling lightly outside the window. Denise walked in carrying another stack of plates. "You don't have to do those," she said. "I know." She stood beside me drying dishes quietly for a moment before speaking again. "I used to think your life was sad." I looked at her gently. "And now?" She smiled through tears gathering in her eyes. "I think it was brave." That nearly broke me. Not because I needed praise, because after 62 years, my sister finally saw me clearly. And maybe that's all most people really want before the end of their story. To be seen truthfully. Not perfectly. Just truthfully. If this story reminded you of someone whose sacrifices went unnoticed for too long, maybe reach out to them while you still can. Sometimes respect arrives late, but it still matters when it comes from the heart. And if you believe quiet strength deserves to be remembered too, I hope you'll stay for more stories like this.